With the very latest from Mariupol, that horrifying Russian airstrike on a building that had been sheltering hundreds of women and children. There is new word this morning from city officials that there may in fact be survivors. This is video taken of the aftermath. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky says the building was hit by, in his words, a huge Russian bomb. And as you can see, much of what was the Donetsk Regional Theater of Drama in the center of the besieged city is destroyed. Ukrainian officials say the building was known to be an air raid shelter. This is video posted on social media said to have been recorded a week ago, and it shows women, children, and the elderly seeking refuge in the theater's basement. Now, look at this, because adding to the growing international outrage over the airstrike is this image, a satellite photo from Maxar Technologies showing the word children written in Russian on the ground in front and behind the theater. Ukrainian officials say the writing was meant to be large enough and clear enough to be seen by the Russian warplanes that have been bombing Mariupol for weeks now. This morning, hours after the theater was destroyed, there is no still official word on just how many people were killed or now, based on this new word, how many have survived. We begin with David Common this morning, who is once again in Lviv, Ukraine. And David, as we speak, this war is entering its fourth week. It is exactly 3 Thursdays since we were talking about the initial strikes and the initial raid from Russia into Ukraine. This morning, we are talking about this horrific airstrike on the theater, the bomb shelter. But word of survivors this morning. What are the latest details you're hearing there?
Well, Heather, when you look at the enormity of that devastation, it is sort of mind-blowing that anybody could have survived it, and yet that is the indication that there are survivors in the rubble who are now being pulled out of that theater in Mariupol. This is, as you say, an area that people had fled to. It has a deep cavernous basement, one that allows them some protection from the airstrike that indeed ended up striking that building. Up to 1,200 people, many of them children, had taken refuge inside that building. And as you know, children had been written on 2 sides of the building as a signal to the invaders from Russia, basically, don't target this place. But that is what ended up happening. We'll await word from Ukraine's emergency services, which are working to get people out of that area. But you think about it, I'm in Lviv. Lviv is, by comparison, a much calmer city. There are air raid sirens, but you don't see what you're seeing in many other cities: artillery attacks, airstrikes, rockets hitting buildings like this in behind me. You know, these are large apartment buildings where people live and continue to live in many of these cities in other areas. You talk about Mariupol or Kharkiv or Kherson, which is now under Russian control, even the capital, Kiev. These are areas that people live. Many of them have gone into bomb shelters. Others have stayed in their flats, but they're getting pummeled from afar. And it is a difference in the Russian strategy. The Russians have not been able to advance. They have faced significant Ukrainian resistance that has only been built up over the last few days because the Russians have engaged in what's known as an operational pause. They have not moved their ground forces. Instead, they may be resupplying them, getting food and other weapons into them, perhaps changing some of the people who would be exhausted, moving new soldiers in place. Even we are hearing reports of mercenaries coming potentially from Syria, from the Pacific Theater in Russia as well, soldiers being brought from that far away. They are coming in for what might be the next phase as we enter this fourth week of the conflict. But at the same time, what you are seeing is the Russians continue to utilize what they did in Syria, and that is to pummel from the air, either with warplanes or with artillery from a great distance, hitting very often residential structures, perhaps in an effort, if they can't enter the city and beat the Ukrainians, to try to starve them out into submission.
David, let me ask you, that airstrike in Mariupol and what you were just referencing there, the increasing bombardment of other civilian areas. You've made an interesting observation about how they are behind something that you're seeing there in Lviv this morning.
Well, certainly a number of things that we're seeing over the course of this morning. But, as you look at that Mariupol attack, I would just sort of bring you to some of the strategy that might be behind it, both the strategic importance of defending that port city, but the strategic importance of seizing it on the part of the Russians. If they're able to seize it, they get a bridgehead onto the Black Sea, they can unload soldiers from ships, they can pour in, they can bypass that city if need be, and head into other areas like Odessa, which continues to be under attack, but which they do not yet control. They can move more soldiers up the road into this area, into Western Ukraine. They can also move soldiers into Kiev. And so in some ways, the fall of Mariupol could end up being the fall of Kiev. And that is why the Ukrainians have spent the last 8 years, since 2014, since the annexation of nearby Crimea, building up the defenses of Mariupol for a moment like this.
David, thank you very much. David Common reporting for us once again in Lviv.